Welcome to this INSEAD Knowledge interview at the European Business Summit here in Brussels, a summit devoted this year to the topic of climate change, reducing carbon emissions, making the economy greener in general, but also on the topic of innovation. We're speaking now with Craig Barrett. Welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here.
You're the chairman of Intel Corporation. One of the roundtables you're participating in is called Education, Managing Europe's Pipeline to Drive Innovation. Do you really feel that there's a growing skills gap between Europe and the rest of the world when it comes to training and research?
I think if you look at all the leading indicators, both the European Union and the U.S. are in about the same category. There's a declining interest in our young people in the areas of math, science, engineering, technology. Our universities are doing fairly well. In the U.S., we import a lot of our university student body from foreign countries. Over half of the degrees, advanced degrees in technology and engineering in the U.S. are granted to foreign nationals, for example. So we're not doing a good job at taking our own students, our own citizens, and getting them interested in educating these topics. In Europe, you see the same sort of trends. If you compare that to Asia, China, some of the other countries around the world, all the leading indicators are pointing in a negative direction. Our standard of living is such that we can only compete with our minds and our ideas and innovating rapidly. We can only do that with education, investment in R&D. So unless Europe and the U.S. excel at that, we're going to see standards of living go down, competitiveness go down, our ranking of our economies in the world go down.
So whose fault is it at the end of the day? Where do you place the blame for this shift?
It's not a blame game. There's a whole bunch of environmental factors that are playing here. If you look at all of the emerging economies around the world, their governments, their media, their cultures, their societies are focused very much on growing. They focus very much on the necessity to grow requires well-educated people, typically in the technical areas. So almost the poorer the economy, the greater the interest in the areas important to the future, and the wealthier the economy, it's inverse, the less the interest in these topics. So it's a government issue, it's a societal issue, it's a media issue, it's a parental issue. No one captures all of the blame, but it's all of these factors working together.
So do you make any concrete suggestions today about how Europe can avoid losing out in the global R&D battle?
If you just talked about R&D, this is very much an issue that two constituencies support. It's industry and the government. And unless both of those areas invest heavily in R&D, then we're going to lose out in the battle of ideas. And the ideas are really the seed corn for the next generation of products, businesses, wealth creation. So governments have to take it as a high priority. Businesses have to take it as a high priority. The European agenda says, or Lisbon agenda says, 3% of GDP should go into R&D. That would be wonderful if it's happening. In the U.S., we're all arguing for a greater fraction of our GDP to go into R&D. It'd be wonderful if it's happening. Unfortunately, on both sides of the Atlantic, it's not happening. It is happening, though, in the rest of the world.
Well, let's just stop to compare Europe and the United States for 1 second. It doesn't seem that the United States is faring too badly with a partnership that appears to work between private sector companies, between government, universities, and of course venture capitalists. It all appears to form a virtuous cycle which is lacking in Europe when it comes to innovation. Could you give us your contrasted views about the situations in Europe and in the United States?
I think in the U.S. there is a much closer cooperation between business, the government, and universities. The universities are really the source of our basic research in the U.S. There is a closer cooperation than there is here in Europe, and that's good. But on an absolute basis, you have to say the U.S. needs to be better if it wants to maintain its economic position in the world. So it's easy to just look between Europe and the U.S. and say, am I better than you, and everything is okay, it's rosy, but that's not where the competition is. And every leading indicator suggests that both of our geographic areas are facing a problem, maybe not so much this year, but in 5 years and 10 years. And the sort of things we're talking about, basic research, has payoffs in the 5, 10, 15-year cycle. So you need to be investing today for a decade from today. And I don't think either one of us, either one of our areas is doing a particularly strong job. I don't think it's a powerful government focus, and I don't think private industry is doing as much as they might on either side. And sure, the U.S. has got a vibrant venture capital industry. Intel is the biggest high-tech venture capital investor in the world. Intel Capital, which is our VC arm. We used to do 90% of our investments in the U.S. Today, 50% of them are done outside of the U.S., and increasingly that 50% is targeted towards Asia. So the entrepreneurs, the education, the ideas, the environment in Asia is becoming competitive with what we have in the U.S. already.
Well, with the global overview that you have, what do you feel like telling European regulators and policymakers about how could they create more global entrepreneurs coming out of Europe? I mean, to date, most of these global innovative companies have been coming out of the United States for the last couple of decades.
You're going to compete with two things, smart minds and smart ideas. So you need to have the best education system, and that education system needs to be coupled towards, not totally towards industry, but you need a big input from industry, so the education is not ivory towered, it's not isolated, it's not separated from the real world. You want it associated with, but you still want educational institutions to have a large degree of independence and do their thing and not be totally influenced by industry, but it should be an association. You need to have the education of the people coming out competitive, not just with your next door neighbor, but competitive in the world. So unless governments, societies say, I need the best education system in the world, I need to be creating the best ideas by investing heavily in research and development, you're not going to be competitive going forward. So my advice is very simple. It's invest in smart minds, invest in smart ideas, and then make sure the environment is suitable for investments and innovations, bright ideas to get together with bright minds and do something. And that's government policy, it's tax rates, it's venture capital institutions, it's societal attitudes towards taking a chance, being an entrepreneur. There are many societies where failure is considered to be terrible. If you go to Latin America, for example, failure in business is considered to be a personal failure. And so many of the young people in Latin America don't want to take a chance. But Intel and many educational institutions are starting to teach entrepreneurship in these environments, teaching people, all right, if you're going to take a chance, these are the things that you have to be cognizant of, these are the plans that you have to go through, this is how you can take an intelligent risk. If you take an intelligent risk and you fail, you've learned something. The U.S., we are fortunate that learning something in the U.S. through failure is not considered bad.
Let's focus for just 1 second on what you've been doing in the field of education and creating new entrepreneurs. What examples can you give of what Intel has been doing on the ground?
Three general areas. One is we're very much interested in primary education system, and we're training teachers around the world how to bring technology into the classroom, not to teach technology, but to use technology to make education more interesting. We've trained over 5 million teachers around the world. Over the next 4 years, we'll train another 8 or 9 million teachers around the world. It's probably the biggest integrated teacher training program the world has ever seen on how to effectively bring technology into the classroom. It's one thing we're doing. Second thing is we're actively involved with research institutions around the world. We have close associations with about 150 universities, over 300 research contracts around the world. This is important to us as a company because basic research is done in the university environment, making the contacts with students, faculty, also funding research programs, which are of generic interest to us, is how we keep in touch with the basic research institutions. And then lastly, we are, as I said, the world's largest venture capital institution, but we're not just a venture capital institution that just funds venture capital from a distance. We actually get involved in the entrepreneurial aspect. So we have worked very closely with the University of California. The Haas Business School has a great entrepreneurial education program and have been translating that program around the world, basically sponsoring professors from various countries to get involved in that program and then take that program back to their separate universities.
Obviously, one of the big topics here in Brussels at this summit is climate change. Now, what can you bring to the debate on climate change? The technology industry is not a big polluter or a big energy user, but perhaps some of the solutions that the information technology field can bring to the table can help others clean up their act.
Two aspects. One, we are a big manufacturing company and we're actually a big user of energy, and so we can demonstrate to the rest of the world that we become more energy efficient. We can use less water, less energy, emit less greenhouse gases, use fewer chemicals, so forth. And we try to do that. A 50% reduction of greenhouse gases, 30% reduction in electricity used per unit of production. So we try to practice what the world is preaching in this space, demonstration. As you do point out, the ICT industry uses about 2% of the world's power. So if we got rid of 100% of our usage, we'd only go down in the world by 2%. What are the major sources of greenhouse gases? What are the major sources of energy usage? And it's pretty clear. It's energy generation is a big greenhouse gas producer. Transportation, whether it's automobile or truck or airplane, major users of energy. Housing, buildings and houses, major consumer power, and then manufacturing. In each one of those four areas, the intelligent use of information technology, computers, computer control, feedback loops, and all that, can make them much more efficient. You know, a modern day car has all sorts of computers built in it, not just for the entertainment system, but to make the engines run more effectively and efficiently, to emit less pollutants. We can work there. If you look at the area of housing and buildings and air conditioning control, ICT controls can make them much more energy efficient. So perhaps our biggest influence is to cooperate with these other areas, bring our technology to their utilization. But I'd suggest if we analyze this, you do a very simple engineering analysis. Look at the biggest energy users, and then you'll find it's a small number contribute to about 80% of the problem. And then put the technology at that small number. Don't get too confused by looking at every aspect of the world. And I've heard lots of interesting analyses here about e-meetings and e-medicine and so forth and so on. But frankly, the biggest generators of greenhouse gases are energy production, transport, buildings, manufacturing. You have to go after the big users of energy if you want to have any impact in the world.
Intel is now celebrating its 40th anniversary. Obviously, in the last 40 years, microchips have completely changed the way we live our day-to-day lives. Where do you see information technology now going in the next 40 years? I mean, for example, does Moore's law continue to apply, whereby microchips double their processing power every 18 months on average?
Moore's law has an empirical observation. It's actually been going now for 48 years. It'll probably go for another 10 or 15 years at least. You asked about what happens in the next 40 years. I would never guesstimate what's going to happen 40 years hence. I mean, things like the internet came along really out of some basic research done actually here in Europe at CERN, and basically a simple communication protocol that physicists around the world communicate with each other, and all of a sudden it became the source of information, the source of communication, the source of entertainment, source for commerce. These things come out of strange little cubby holes. Basic research has a tendency to do this. I mean, you never quite know what's going to be the outcome of some of this fundamental research that creates ideas and creates new tools and techniques. If you look in the short term, but it's pretty clear what's going to happen. The internet's more important, access to the internet's more important, mobility is more important, broadband is more important. If you roll all this together, we're just going to have more gadgets that work at lower power, that have greater displays, better user interface, access to more information on a continuous basis. You know, a lot of people get really futuristic and they say, all you're going to have to do is open your jacket and here's a flexible screen and that's your computer screen in the future and the fabric of your clothes. You know, let's not go quite that far, but broadband mobility, the next generation, whether it's the extrapolation of the 3G technologies or one of these new technologies like WiMAX comes into play around the world, has a big impact. Visualization, user interface gets to be much better.
I'm surprised that you didn't mention just now nanotechnologies, as your microchips have been becoming smaller and smaller.
Nanotechnology is one of the most overused and least understood phrases that mankind has ever coined. You know, nanotech is making small things. Everything Intel makes is small. You know, everything that we make, every transistor we make 2 billion transistors a second at our company. Every one of those 2 billion transistors is a nanotech device. It doesn't mean anything. It's what problem you solve with that device, which is important. Do we make more powerful microprocessors every year? Absolutely. You know, in 1997, we created the first teraflop computer, the first computer to do 10 to the 12th floating point instructions or instructions per second. It was with Sandia Laboratory in the United States. It took 10,000 microprocessors, took 200 square meters, it took 500 kilowatts to get 1 teraflop. Today we have a small chip about 1 centimeter square with 80 little compute cores on it. It does 1 teraflop. That's 10 years later, from 10,000 processors, 500 kilowatts, a big building to hold this, to a small chip. That we'll see more of. It won't be a teraflop, it'll be a petaflop, which is 10 to the 15th instructions per second, or an exaflop, which is 10 to the 18th instructions per second. What you can do with that compute capacity is phenomenal. The National Academy of Engineering in the United States just issued their new set of grand challenges. Those challenges which, if you bring more technology to bear, more compute capability, things that you can solve, molecular dynamics, creating personalized medicine, weather prediction, making solar energy effective and efficient. These types of problems get to be solvable when you bring more compute capacity to play. That's what the future is.
Craig Barrett, Chairman of Intel Corporation, thank you very much.
My pleasure.